All right. So, a couple things before we get going. The longer you talk, the longer we're going to be here. Okay. So, all we've got left is after class today, you'll see that 13th, well, not 13th, but the module 13 quiz pop up here on Canvas when I get back to my office between 11 and 11:30. That's due at the end of the day on Monday. And you then have that Canvas discussion, which is due at the end of the day next Wednesday. Okay. So once the due date passes on the module quiz, I'll update Canvas. And I think I misspoke on Tuesday's class, and I'll drop your two lowest quizzes. So I'll have Canvas updated to do that. It's currently already updated to show what your grade is with that lowest module reading drop. Then after class today, I'll have it set so it drops your four lowest in-class quizzes. Okay. That should be all the rest of the assignments for the semester. Some other things I wanted to kind of mention, I'll mention at the end of class today, just regards to kind of like the available help for you kind of studying for the exam. The thing I did want to mention at the beginning here, and I'll post an announcement up about this and I'll talk more about it in class next Thursday. Our exam, so it's the same day and time in the syllabus, the 6th which is Wednesday from 8 to 10. It's not going to be here. Okay. So I have two sections taking the exam at the same time. You guys are going to be split in between two rooms in Hodge. So I think it's like 1055 and 1059 are the room numbers. You guys are more familiar with Hodge Hall than I am, but they're like two big lecture halls right next to each other. So they're in kind of the same location. It's just that there's like a wall separating them. So just like the other two exams, same kind of procedures. I'll have a bunch of proctors there. So I'm going to start the exam in that location, get everything set up for you guys. I'll be there for like the first 30 minutes or so. And then I'm going to go check on my other kind of location, stay there for about an hour, and then come back and end the exam the last 30 minutes with you guys. Okay. If I'm not there and you have any questions, all of the proctors they can try to answer your question. They should be able to. If they for some reason can't, I'll have my phone and my email kind of checking them when I'm not in the room and get them a response as quick as possible. But everything looks very similar to what we did for the in-class midterm exams. Once again, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about that on Thursday's class as well. But I wanted to get that location out to you so you can find it well in advance, know where it's at, so you don't, show up in Hodge and can't find it on Wednesday of the exam. Okay. So once again, that's in room 1055 and 1059. In the announcement I post tomorrow about that final exam location, I'll kind of basically tell you if your last name starts with, and I don't know the cutoff exactly yet, but like A through L will be in 1055. M through Z will be in 1059 or something like that. So keep an eye out for that announcement. Other than that, we don't have class on Tuesday, right? So I'll be posting a replacement video on that YouTube page, kind of just working through some review problems. And then next Thursday, we'll have class as usual, but we'll just be doing review. So come with your questions. We'll work through as many problems as we possibly can. Other than that, that should be all the housekeeping stuff before we jump into material here today. Are there any questions for me? Yeah, so I'll mention at the end, but basically, I don't know the exact times and locations yet. I don't think they'll all be full, but next Thursday there will be some CL sessions. I'll get an announcement about that as soon as I know. So I'm checking with all the CL leaders. I know that right now 6 of the 9 are filled. I don't know if all 9 will get filled, but there will at least be multiple locations that are available at every time slot next Thursday as well. Yeah, so there'll be a few more questions. So it's weighted a little bit heavier. So there's 30 questions as opposed to 25, but you've got 2 hours, so you've got more time per question. Yep. But similar format as the other. Any other questions before we dive back into material here? And once again, if you have more questions next Thursday, you can kind of ask. You can always email me. Check the syllabus first, maybe, like the day and, time and stuff like that are in the syllabus. Okay. So we left off with a couple definitions that we'll reuse today as we're working through some problems and working through some additional material. So we talked about these monopolistic competitive markets are somewhere in between a monopolist, somewhere in between perfectly competitive. Firms have some market power, but not complete, like a monopolist. Okay? So we said we determine the profit maximizing price and quantity very similar to a monopolist, but like a perfectly competitive market, we can have positive or negative profits in the short run, and we can have firms entry and exit, which lead us to this long run outcome that's the same as a perfectly competitive market, which is that profits are zero. So even when we're in the long run, we said that these firms aren't operating efficiently and they're not at the minimum point of their average total cost curve. So we had something called excess capacity. And then because they have some market power, in a perfectly competitive market, like everything in the long run is equal. Price was equal to marginal revenue, equal to marginal cost, equal to average total cost, equal to the minimum point of the average total cost. We won't get to that kind of perfect point. The price that they set is actually going to be above their marginal cost, or we're going to have a market. We'll kind of reuse these terms today and kind of talk through the welfare implications. So what I'm going to set up the final topics with is this idea of advertising, and then I'll kind of mention how brand names are really a very similar kind of thing. But if we think about advertising, there's going to be some disagreement on whether or not it should occur. Okay. So we'll think through the reasons why there might be some disagreement. And the first is going to be, why do firms advertise? Why do you see ads? What do those firms hope they're going to do? Convince more people to. You're in the school of business. If you don't know the value of marketing, why do you market? You want people to buy your product, right? So we're going to think initially, I'm advertising because I want to get, well, these monopolistic competitive firms, they don't get all of demand. They're only getting a portion of it. So if I'm the firm that's advertising and nobody else is, what's going to happen to the market share that I can get? It's going to go up. I can increase the overall demand curve that I'm facing. I might now go from 20 to 50% of the overall market. Now, if I'm not advertising, what happens to my market share? It's going to go down, right? Or essentially my demand curve for my product is going to decrease. So what is every firm, so if we just think through the base intuition, if I had a demand increase for my product, do you think I'm going to be able to sell more or less than before? I mean, I don't think this is too crazy, but more units. The whole reason why I'm advertising. I'm going to have more market power, right? Or the demand for my product might become more inelastic. What do you think is going to happen to the price I can get away with charging? It's also going to go up. Well, if we think about our profit equation, once again, someone asked me the other day, and we're reusing things, pi always represents profits, just a shorthand way to write that, right? So if quantity and price go up, what's going to happen to profits from a demand increase? They're going to go up as well. Okay. Now that's just the intuition. We can kind of draw out a graph that supports this. What I'm going to draw out is the opposite. So let's say one firm advertises they increase their market share. We said every other firm is going to get a smaller market share, or their demand curve is going to decrease. So visually, what is that going to look like, and how can we support our intuition? Maybe our intuition's wrong. So if I think about these monopolistically competitive firms, they're going to have some increasing marginal cost curve. Here's their initial demand, and maybe here's their additional marginal revenue. We said we initially start out solving for the profit maximizing quantity. It's going to look very similar to a monopolist. Every firm, though, is going to choose the profit maximizing quantity where, I'm getting tired of saying it, marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, right? So they set the quantity here. Now, for a monopoly or a monopolistic competitive market, they get to set the price for their product. It's slightly different than all the other ones. So they go up to their demand curve, okay? So here, they go up to the demand curve and set the price, okay? So we're going to disentangle the effects of advertising into two different things, and I would only ever ask you about one of those things at a time. So the first thing is, if I'm the one that doesn't advertise, my demand is actually going to decrease. So what is that going to look like? I'll draw it pretty extreme. Let's say the other firm is really good at advertising, right? Well, that's going to decrease my marginal revenue and, my demand and my marginal revenue curve, right? It's going to shift to the left. So what is my new profit maximizing quantity and price? Well, marginal revenue now hits marginal cost down here. So quantity has went down. I go up to the demand curve to set my price. The price has also went down. If price and quantity both decrease, my average total cost for right now, we're assuming hasn't changed, right? Then my profits are going to go down. You can think about it here. If I were to draw in, just to kind of make this point, let's say I have my average total cost curve in here. Initially, what was the difference between price and my average total costs? Right? My profits are the difference between price and average total costs. At that profit maximizing quantity, I started out with positive profits. If I'm the firm that doesn't advertise, what are my new profits? Well, now at this price, my price is below average total cost. So here would be our profits, but they're now negative. So if I'm the firm that doesn't advertise, I'm going to get a smaller portion of the overall demand, and potentially I could go from having positive profits to, if my market share falls enough, my profits could become negative. Now, even if they're not negative, I know they're going to be small. So on the exam, right, I could ask you a question. I have it written and printed. So I could ask you a question where I tell you that the demand for a firm's product either increases or decreases, and you should be able to tell me what happens to their corresponding profit maximizing price, quantity, and the resulting profits. Okay? Now, this is a nice, because like the intuition, the graph supports our intuition, right? Some results are counterintuitive, but these ones I think are pretty intuitive. Okay? Any questions on this idea? So just to connect this, right, to what we've already talked about in previous modules, who is this bad for? The firm that doesn't advertise. So what is their incentive for every firm to do? Advertise. If we all advertise, what happens to our proportion of the overall demand? Stays the same. So the second piece of advertising is, well, advertising isn't free, right? So what did I have to do in order to advertise? I had to spend a bunch of money. Okay? So we'll think about, okay, yes, the fact that advertising might give me a higher proportion of the overall demand curve, that's a good thing for my profits. However, I know that costs also matter when I'm calculating profits. So if we think about a scenario where, let's say, here was my initial average total costs. I solve for that profit maximizing quantity. I go up to the demand curve. I set my price. Price is just barely above my average total cost, but that still means that my profits are positive. Okay. Now, let's assume, right, if there's an incentive for every firm to advertise, what does that sound similar to? When we identify Nash equilibriums, I have two choices, advertise or not. So if everybody chooses to advertise, why could this be an example of a prisoner's dilemma? Well, if we all choose to advertise, we don't change our demand curve. But what have we done? We've essentially changed our costs. Now, have we changed our marginal costs? If I spend, if I buy a Super Bowl ad, spend millions of dollars, if I produce nothing, it still costs me millions of dollars. If I produce 1,000 units, it still costs me millions. So what type of cost would it be? Advertising is a sunk or fixed cost. Right? So my marginal cost curve won't change. Still costs me the same to produce these units, but I've spent a lot more money, right, to run these ad campaigns. So if my marginal cost hasn't changed, everybody's advertising, so my demand and my marginal revenue curve haven't changed. What's going to happen to the profit maximizing price and quantity? Well, marginal cost will still be equal to marginal revenue. At the same point, I go up to the demand curve, I'll set the same price, but now at this quantity, what's true? I'm at a point on my average total cost curve where price is now below average total costs. So now the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity I'm producing is right here. But if price is below average total cost, now my profits are potentially negative. Okay. So if everybody could agree not to advertise, we started out with positive profits. This is a good thing for every firm. If we all advertise, demand doesn't change, but we now have these additional costs. What's happened to profits of every firm? They're now negative. This sounds like a prisoner's dilemma. Right? A Nash equilibrium where everybody is incentivized to spend money on their ad campaigns, but ultimately doesn't change how much of the overall demand curve I can get, and it just increased my costs. So there's competing effects here, right? If my advertising is effective and I can get a higher portion of demand, well, that would help increase my profits. But running ad campaigns is not free, right? So I would have to increase my costs, would actually decrease my profits. It depends on which of those is larger. So I would never give you a question where I kind of combine these. I would either ask you what happens to price, quantity, profits if I saw demand increase or decrease, and then what happens to price, quantity, profits if instead demand doesn't shift, but I just have an increase in my fixed costs, my average total costs. Now here, there is no change in price or quantity, right? So price and quantity don't change, but because I had to spend additional money, this will kind of drive my profits down. Okay, so this is why there's some kind of argument about, is advertising actually effective, right? Any questions over either of these two effects? Once again, I won't combine the two, but in the real world, we would care about which of these is larger. Questions on this? So the next thing that we'll kind of think about is I want to connect these demand shifts to something else that we talked about last class, which is our markup. Okay. So I'll draw out demand increases now so we get kind of an example of both. I'm going to start over here so I leave myself enough room. So I've got quantity, price. Here's my marginal costs. Let's say we start out, here's my demand curve. Here's my marginal revenue. I'm not going to worry about profits for right now because I want to make a separate point without throwing everything on the same graph. So profit maximizing quantity, where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? I then go up to the demand curve and I set my price. The markup is the difference between the price I'm setting and my marginal cost at that profit maximizing quantity. We called that difference the firm's markup. You can think of the markup in some way as representing how much market power this firm has. Right? The more market power I have, I can price my product well above what it costs me to make it. So if I see a demand increase, intuitively, what do you think is going to happen? I'm now going to have more market power. I'm getting a higher proportion of the overall demand curve. I would expect my markup to go up. So if we were to draw in here a demand increase or a shift to the right, well, if demand increases, because marginal revenue is twice as steep as demand, that would also increase my marginal revenue curve. Well, if my marginal revenue has changed and I'm setting the profit maximizing quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, so would that profit maximizing quantity. So where does marginal revenue now equal marginal cost? We said it's at a higher quantity, the reverse of a demand decrease. And when I go up here to set my price, instead of resulting in a lower price, like a demand decrease, a demand increase will result in a higher price. What is my markup? It's the difference between that price I'm setting and where I'm at on the marginal cost curve at that quantity. So I try to kind of draw these to scale. You can see here, the size of my markup has now increased. Okay, so it kind of supports our intuition. Now, if you're a little bit more mathematically minded, you can always draw these out and support why that markup increases from a demand increase. And then the reverse would be true as well. If I had a demand decrease, my markup would decrease. Now, the reason why is because if this marginal revenue curve is twice as steep as demand, you could think about it as if I'm looking at a quantity of 10, maybe the point I'm at in the demand curve is 10, the point I'd be at on marginal revenue would be 5. But if I'm at a quantity of 20, the point I'm at on this demand curve might be 20, and the marginal revenue is 10. That gap grows. Or if I think about at higher quantities, what's happening to that distance between demand and marginal revenue? It's getting larger. So if I'm setting the price going up to the demand curve, the difference between demand and my marginal revenue, which is equal to marginal cost, is always going to be going up. So demand increases will increase our markup. Demand decreases, pushes to lower quantities. That's always going to decrease our markup. Questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Okay. So we'll go back to the slides for a second and just have a discussion. There's one more thing I want to kind of show you. So, critiques of advertising could be that if we're all advertising, no change in demand, we're just spending more money as a society, that's actually going to be a bad thing, right? We're just spending money that has no effects on this market. That's going to be, an argument against why we should want to see advertising. Now, it also might be that if I'm advertising, maybe the actual demand, like the marginal benefit and the marginal cost of this product haven't changed, but I'm convincing consumers that their marginal benefit is higher. So if, in fact, so I always think about like, it's kind of getting into be a data example, but there's things like on TikTok now that are similar. Yeah, I get these ads on like TikTok or Instagram. It used to be QVC and it'd be like, oh, here's this egg peeler slicer, whatever, right? I'm like, oh, I would use this all the time. I buy it, it sits in my kitchen cabinet, I never use it, right? They convinced me that I'm going to have value to my life that I have with the product. Ultimately, I use it once and I don't like it and I never use it again. So if I convince consumers that marginal benefit is actually higher than what it is, then I'm actually essentially creating like negative externalities, right? This would be a bad thing for society. Also, if I can convince consumers that they're going to benefit more than they are, they're going to be willing to pay a higher price. So who could advertising be bad for? Consumers, right? I'm convincing them that this product has value when it actually doesn't. I think about a very similar thing. If you think about, and I've got some slides here in a second, but branding. If I can get a celebrity to endorse my product, it's the same product, but now people think it's cool because their favorite musician or athlete or is using it. Well, I haven't changed the marginal benefit of that product. They just think that they might want it now because this other person does. Now, maybe there's some utility gain because I have the same sweatshirt as, I don't know. This makes me lame, but like saw full disclosure. So I like Counting Crows is going to come to the Indy 500. I saw they post this. I'm like, oh, I'd love to go see them. If they were doing something, maybe I get it as well. Maybe I get some utility from that. All right. But if it's just simply that I think this product is better because a celebrity endorses it, doesn't matter. Right. So we kind of think about these critiques of advertising. We also then kind of drew it out is that it could just be increasing costs. Right. Now, defensive advertising might be that instead of, convincing consumers this has value when it doesn't, maybe I didn't know this product existed before. So I wasn't buying it when in fact it would provide me a high amount of marginal benefit or margin utility. So maybe advertising makes consumers more aware that this product actually has a higher value to them, creating positive externalities. Now, there was another kind of point that would defend advertising is what if through advertising, like let's say there's one main company, right? Everybody knows who, what's a good example? Like everybody knows about, think of a good example here. I don't know. McDonald's, right? But they might not be as well aware of the products that, I don't know, Chick-fil-A or some of those companies offer. So if I make you aware that these other products exist, what am I essentially creating? Well, before, if I only knew one of these companies existing, essentially they had monopoly power. If advertising makes me aware that there's other substitutes, it's going to increase competition, which pushes us closer to this perfectly competitive point, which is where total surplus is maximum. So that would be a defensive advertising. So if you're thinking about, going into marketing or being a marketing major, it's not, we set this up initially, it might be like, well, this is pointless, right? I'm doing a bad thing. It could be good, right? This is why companies spend so much money on their ad campaigns. So one of these, I think an interesting example of this idea to show where it does increase competition is there's some states that for a while, I forget what they were, which ones they were, but they prohibited advertising for contacts and eyeglasses. I don't know why, something about they do this for different medical products as well. And they sell it as though well, we're protecting you against companies just convincing you to buy the product when in fact is less and less. Well, it's really maybe to keep some monopoly power with companies, because if I can't advertise, there's probably only a couple major players in the contact market, like eye contacts, right, or glasses. So if I don't allow these companies to advertise, I don't know that there's all these other companies I could be buying from. So that would essentially decrease competition, which would result in there's less competition. Those firms can get away with setting higher prices. Sure enough, they found in these states that prohibited advertising for eyeglasses and contacts, they actually had higher overall prices. Right? So we've got some good examples where we see that advertising increases competition, pushes us away from these monopolistically competitive markets, closer to a perfectly competitive market. So that would be kind of one defense. I'm going to kind of skip through some of these slides. I had them up. I think I'm going to spend a little more time making sure we work through some models and some review problems here today. But brand names would be kind of a similar thing. And really, brand names are kind of better in the sense that if I have brand names, maybe I'm manipulating consumers how much they think that this product is going to benefit their lives or not. But also, in creating brand names, big brands become big brands for a reason. They're producing higher quality products, and potentially that brand tells you something about the quality of that product, which would tell you oh, this is a higher marginal benefit to me, because if I buy a sweatshirt from, I don't know, the Shop, which is a place in Indianapolis that does a lot of Indiana gear. I've got something there. They make high quality products. Well, that's going to last me years, whereas if I buy it from Temu, it's going to fall apart in the next 3 months, right? So there maybe brands are a good thing because it signals something to me about the quality of the product. If it's higher quality, my demand and my marginal benefit should be higher. Now, another unique thing about brands I like to think about in the context of what we already talked about earlier is we said when I advertise, I have two things going on. I had to spend a bunch of money, which hurt my profits, but I was maybe getting a higher portion of the overall demand curve, right? And increasing my profits here. If I can get a free celebrity endorsement, so maybe this is just through networking. I am involved in, I don't know, and I have a good connection with a bunch of Indianapolis Colts players. If I can get them to use my product for free, have I changed my cost at all? No. But if other people seeing them use this product and they're pushing it out in their social media, what have I done to my demand curve? Increased it, which now I know that profits are definitely, sorry, this isn't the only one. Profits are definitely now going to increase because I didn't have to change my cost. So this is why, if I was starting a business and, you see a lot of these smaller businesses, what do? They send out these mass emails to try to get, all these celebrities, different people to endorse their product because it's essentially free. I guess there's a time cost of sending emails, but relatively low if I can get these celebrities to endorse my product. So, we're starting to think about how these things would apply to the real world. Now, once again, when it comes to the exam, I'll only ever ask you about just singling out demand shifts or just singling out kind of changes in costs. Okay. Any questions? Like I said, I'm going a little bit off of maybe what you would expect to know on the exam in terms of a more heuristic view of why we advertise, why we see these kind of brand names or celebrity endorsements created. The only other thing I want to make sure we go through before we get to kind of reviewing some practice problems is the following, okay? So let's say I've got a slightly different thing, which is And what do I want here? So I'll make sure that I draw this pretty extreme to make this point. So let's say here's the demand for my product. Here's the marginal revenue. I set that profit maximizing quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. I then go up here to set my price. Okay. Now I'm going to draw out an example just to kind of revisit some concepts here. So maybe here was my initial average total cost. Okay. So at this price was exactly equal to average total cost. Now, if we think about our profit equation, if price is exactly equal to average total cost, my profits initially would be what? 0. So this could potentially, technically, I guess profits can be positive in the short run, and we still see things change and go up or down. But if I have profits of 0, likely that means that I'm in the long run. Now, if we start out with profits of 0 and one firm is able to identify something like they come up with a new technology and have a patent on it, or they come up with, they identify maybe a cheaper labor source to have produce their product, what they can do is essentially not change their fixed costs, right? Because this technology or this cheaper labor force means that every unit I'm producing, I can now produce at a lower marginal costs. So here I haven't just shifted my average total cost curve, I've shifted my marginal cost curve. But if my marginal costs change, those are similar, not quite the same, but you can think of them as those are variable costs. They depend on my production. So if my variable costs change, what's also going to happen, I'm also changing my average total, right? Whenever marginal cost shifts, so will that average total cost. So if that's the case, where is my profit maximizing quantity and price now? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I go up to the demand curve to kind of set my price. So here's where we might get some counterintuitive results. So if I'm thinking about I came with this new technology or identified a labor force so I can produce this good at a lower cost, if I can produce it at a lower cost, do you think I'm going to want to produce more or less than before? Well, if I'm doing this at a lower cost, there's going to be some units that maybe weren't profitable before that now are, right? So quantity should increase, which sure enough, our model supports that. However, initially you might think, oh, if I can lower costs, probably also change, increase my price. Here's where it's a little bit counterintuitive. What happened to the price of this product? It actually went down. Well, if quantity is going up, price is going down, I don't know what's going to happen to profits. Right? Now, in the model I drew out here, profits went from 0 to price is now above average total cost. So here I went from 0 profits to positive. Actually, I know that profits will always increase. The reason why is because we said whenever my marginal revenue is positive, which as long as I have some marginal cost, I'm always going to be at a point where marginal cost and marginal revenue are positive. We said, what's true about my demand there? For a monopolist or monopolistic competitive market, when marginal revenues are positive, or these monopolies or monopolistically competitive markets, they're always going to be on the elastic portion of their demand curve. Okay? So my elasticity of demand was the percentage change in quantity over my percentage change in price. If that's greater than 1, what I know is that that percentage change in quantity must be greater than my percentage change. That's the only way this fraction is above 1. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize this went off the screen. Thank you. Right? So knowing that demand is elastic, all that's telling me is that the percentage change in quantity must be greater than that percentage change in price. So if my quantity goes up and it's elastic, that quantity increase is going to be much greater than my price decrease. So what's going to happen to profits? Well, the lower price hurts them, but by a much smaller amount, that increase in quantity helps them. So my profits are going to go up, which is what that model kind of shows us as well. So a little bit of a counterintuitive result here, that if I see a change in the marginal cost of a firm, that's going to increase my quantity but decrease my price. But because we know they're always on the elastic portion of the demand curve, we always know that that change in quantity will be greater than percent change in price, and my profits are going to increase. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Monopolies. Anytime marginal revenue is positive, we know that we must be on the elastic. It's a similar idea here because what is total revenue? Price times quantity. So if I have positive marginal revenue, I know total revenue is going up. What must be true as I move it down the demand curve, it must be that the change in quantity is always going to be greater than that percentage change in price, which tells me that it's elastic. Yep. You don't have to go through this and show it every time. If you want, you can just kind of remember the monopolist or monopolistic competitive market will always be at an elastic point of the demand curve. Their marginal revenues will always be positive because if they weren't positive, that would mean marginal revenue is hitting marginal cost at a negative value. How can my marginal cost be negative? That means someone's paying me to produce the good. That doesn't make any sense. Right? So that's why we know we'll always be on that elastic portion, and which is why this changes in our cost, lowering of the cost would always increase our profits. Okay. Any other questions on this idea? Okay. All right. So that'll be the last of anything new that we talk about. So if I go here, we'll have our last module quiz. I think I've got it set to be 1020. We'll kind of work through this. Yeah, let me make sure. So the code is 10.20, so 10.20. So we'll get this to load here. So 10.20. Excuse me, we'll get you into that quiz that pulls up for me here. The internet might be a little bit slow today. There we go. So let's look at this kind of first question, and we'll kind of talk through it together. So we want to compare monopoly markets to both perfectly and monopolistically. Sorry, we want to compare monopolistic competitive markets to both monopolies and perfectly competitive markets. Everything working okay? Maybe I got the code wrong. Oh, I did because I changed it for the other section. Let me look up what it is. I think it's. Yeah. So I'll give us a little bit more time in case. Then we'll see what the code was. Forgot to update it for this section. Thank you. So 13.00, even easier, right? So we'll think about this first question. So 13.00 will get you in. We're going to compare these monopolistic competitive markets and firms to perfectly competitive and monopoly markets. Okay. So we kind of already did this last class, so we're really reviewing. The first thing we'll do is compare this to a perfectly competitive market. Okay. So when we're comparing monopolistically competitive firms to perfectly competitive firms, right? This is what we'd be thinking about. Okay. So I've got here my marginal revenue, and I want, here we'll talk about. Here's kind of my average total cost curve. We said if we had a perfectly competitive market, we end up at that minimum point of our average total cost curve. The equilibrium price of the good is the firm's marginal revenue. That'll be equal to their marginal cost at the lowest possible point of that average total cost curve. Okay, that's what we know about these perfectly competitive markets. So here is our perfectly competitive quantity, and that equilibrium price, well, that was the perfectly competitive price. Okay, so if I'm thinking about a monopolistically competitive firm, we said this isn't their demand curve. They have some market power. They can set the price. How do they do that? They choose the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We go up here to the demand curve to set the price. So what's going to be true? The monopolistically competitive firm chooses a higher price, but restricts quantity. Anytime we have market power, the firms will restrict quantity and set higher prices. Okay? Now, if this is true for every firm, at the market level, when we add them all up, what will be true about the market quantity? It's going to be, for a perfectly competitive firm, it will be higher. For a monopolistic competitive firm, right? It's going to be, it just depends on how we say it, right? The perfectly competitive quantity will be higher than a monopolistic competitive market, or vice versa. Right? So we know the monopolistically competitive firm will set a lower quantity, which results in a lower quantity in the market. Right? And then the price will be higher. Okay? So there's some options there we can kind of work through in a second, but this would be kind of the visual support. If I want to compare this to a monopolist, here's where it gets a little tricky. Okay. So if I was just thinking about a firm, right, the monopolist faces the entire demand curve of the market. Right? So they'll make this decision based off of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. They'll kind of come up here to set the price. Right? We said in a monopolistically competitive market, we don't face the entire demand curve. We only face a portion of it. There's many firms, so there is some competition. If there's some competition, are they going to be able to set as high of a price as when there's no competition, a monopolist? No, their price is going to be set lower, and with less market power, I can't restrict quantity as much. Now, the problem is if I think about it at the firm level, well, a monopolistically competitive firm, they are going to set a lower price and a lower quantity, but this is at the firm level. Okay. So if I'm thinking about the firms, well, I'm now one of many. Of course, my quantity is going to be less than a monopolist. But if we're talking about the entire market, I would have to add up the quantity of every single firm. Because there's less market power, the quantity we see in a monopolistically competitive market, we won't see quantity restricted as much as when there is absolutely no competition or when we're looking at a monopoly market. So at the firm level, monopolistically competitive firms set lower quantities than monopolists. This comes what's intuitive. We're splitting demand, right? Where the monopolist gets all of demand. But at the market level, monopolistically competitive firms have less market power, so they're not going to be able to restrict quantity as much as the monopolist. And then the same kind of principle applies. If they're all setting a lower price, well, to get the market price, we don't add up all the prices. It just is whatever those firms are charging. So whether or not we're looking at the firm or the market level, the monopolist has more market power. They're always going to set a higher price. Is that clear what I'm saying about differences between the firm and the market here? So just for the sake of time here, I think I had it set to be 1022, but we'll kind of walk through these. So what did we say? It's a monopoly competitive market will result in a lower quantity than a monopoly market. Well, that one wasn't true. We said the firm will, but the overall market, there's less market power. It won't restrict quantity as much. That was not true. It results in higher prices than a monopolist. Well, if there's more market power in a monopoly market, they're going to be able to set a higher price. So that one's not true, right? Monopolist competitive firms are setting lower prices. They're going to set a lower quantity in the perfectly competitive market. Yeah, perfectly competitive means no market power. So if there's some market power, they can restrict one. So that would be the one that's true. And then are they going to set a lower or higher price in the perfectly competitive market? Well, there's now some market power, so they can get away with charging a higher price. So that one's not true either. So the only one we had there being true is that monopolist competitive markets result in lower quantities than a perfectly competitive. Any questions on that idea before we kind of keep moving here? I'll give you a quick summary here in a second. But just to make sure we're kind of getting this submitted, I think I set it to 1022. So make sure you're kind of getting this submitted. The second question is Now we'll do some review now, the next 30 minutes or so, on monopolistically competitive questions from that one of the final practice exams. But to kind of help guide the video that I'm going to record tomorrow to replace Tuesday's class, which of the topics do you want to see the most review on, both in that video and then in next Thursday's class when we meet together? So keep in mind, we'll do a little bit of review of monopolies and competitive markets here in the next 30 minutes, but monopolies, perfectly competitive, monopolies competitive, for kind of that game theory module. So just respond with which one you want to see review the most. There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just going to collect that data and then kind of have it change, what questions I focus mainly on in that recording. Okay. Is that clear? There's no right or wrong answer on that second one. So make sure you're getting it submitted before 10:22 here. Once we do that, it's the last in-class quiz we've got. Okay. Maybe I might say something at the end of class. Okay. So everybody good with this? Okay. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is do a little bit of review by going through some of these practice problems on practice exam A. Okay. So we've talked through monopolies of the competitive markets. These questions will probably revisit a lot of what we talked about in Tuesday's class, but I'll throw in some additional things as well. Okay. So if I've got this visual, before we get to the question, where would the perfectly competitive firm end up at? So a perfectly competitive market ends up where supply is equal to demand. That's where the equilibrium price gets set. What represents supply? Marginal cost. So where does marginal cost equal demand? Out here at this quantity. Okay. So here the perfectly competitive firm would end up at a quantity of 26. They have no market power. So that equilibrium price of 60 is going to be the price every firm charges. Now, what would kind of support that I'm in the long run here for a perfectly competitive market? Price is equal to average total cost. So profits would be 0. Right? Those are long run profits for a perfectly competitive market. Now, what would also be true if this was a perfectly competitive market? If I'm in the long run, what are the only types of costs I have? So in the long run, we eliminate fixed costs. So I might throw in, not I want to say trick questions, but questions that get at this concept that if I give you a long run depiction, where's my average variable cost curve here? It is my average total cost. They're the exact same thing. So just kind of making that point, reviewing some things we've already talked about that might show up in earlier questions that we won't go through today, but as you're working through these practice exams, you might see. So we'll now move on to thinking about, okay, this was, we're focusing today on monopolistically competitive markets. Where would the monopolistically competitive firm choose to be in this model? Where they choose the profit maximizing quantity, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal costs. That's going to be down here at a quantity of 20. Sure enough, relative to the perfectly competitive market, they're restricting quantity. Okay. So once they set this quantity, the price would be 40, right? No, right? How do they set the price? They go up to the demand curve. The demand curve tells me how much consumers are willing to pay. Well, why would I charge them 40 if they're willing to pay 80? Right? So that second part is, once I find the profit maximizing quantity where marginal cost is the marginal revenue, I go up to the demand curve to set the price. So this question doesn't ask me about the profit maximizing quantity and price. It asks me about profits, which the profit equation is going to be the number of units we sell times the difference between price and average total cost. So we've identified the price was 80. The quantity was what? 20. The price was 80. The only thing left I need is my average total cost. At this quantity, what is my average total cost? 70. So if I compute this here, I end up with 200. Now, right away, if I'm worried about doing calculations, I don't have a calculator and I don't trust my brain, I can see here that at that profit maximizing quantity, price is greater than average total cost. So I know profit should be positive. I could rule out B and C right away. Now, I made this point about a perfectly competitive market. If instead this was a monopolistically competitive market, what do I know here? Profits are positive. It must be in the short run. So here I've got positive profits. The next question asks this: what is the markup of the firm? So the markup is the difference between price and our marginal costs. So at that quantity of 20, that profit maximizing quantity, my marginal costs are equal to 40. So the difference between 80 and 40 would be 40. That's my markup. Okay. Now the second part asks me for what is my excess capacity. So I'll show you on this, but then I'll draw something out that you might see on the exam. So what do I compare to find excess capacity? I look at the quantity that the monopolistic competitive firm is at, and I look at the difference between where the efficient scale of production is. So that sounds similar to where the perfectly competitive market would be, but they might not necessarily be the case, which I'll show you in a second. In this case, they are the same because the perfectly competitive market ended up where supply is equal to demand, which was the minimum point of our average total cost curve. That minimum point of the average total cost curve, that is the efficient scale of production. It's the quantity, which here would be what? 26. That puts me on the lowest possible point of my average total cost curve. Now, how do I identify what the lowest possible point of my average total cost curve is? What intersects the average total cost with its minimum point? Marginal costs. Right? So here, that efficient scale of production would be 26. The monopolistic competitive firm is only producing 20. So the markup was 40, and we had the excess capacity would be 26 minus 26. Okay. Any questions on that? Before I throw you one other way I could maybe show this to you. So let's say instead I had something that looked like this. Okay. So I want, here's my marginal cost. I've got a demand curve here. Got a twice as steep marginal revenue. Let's say I have an average total cost curve that looks something like this. Okay. So the monopolistic competitive firm sets that quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. They go up to that demand curve. They set the price. So I have a drawing here where profits start out as price is equal to average total cost. Profits are 0. Okay. So maybe this is even the long run outcome for a monopolistic competitive firm. Right. We said if profits were positive, if profits are positive, firms would enter that market, driving profits to 0. If firms are negative, firms will exit that market until profits are 0. Now, if I wanted to find my excess capacity, the way I would think about this in terms of writing out the equation, it's the quantity that the monopolistic competitive market chooses, the difference between that and the efficient scale of production. Now, technically, I should have wrote it the other way just to kind of get a positive value, but I'm really just interested in what that difference is. Okay. So what is that efficient scale of production? It's the quantity that puts me at the minimum point of my average total cost curve. So where would that be here? Well, I know it's where my drawing's not perfect, but like if I was better at kind of drawing this U shape, right? It's going to be where the marginal cost hits that average total cost curve. We know the marginal cost hits average total cost at its minimum point. That is the efficient scale of production. So here, these would be the values that I'm using to calculate my excess capacity. What I would not be comparing to is where demand is equal to supply. Okay. In the short run, or even the long run for a monopolistic competitive firm, these values, these quantities might be different. So when you calculate excess capacity, you're always comparing it to the quantity that puts you on that lowest possible point of the average total cost curve. Is that clear what I'm saying there? And how that's different than the visual I gave you earlier? Because the visual I gave you earlier, these things happen at the same point. Okay. Any questions on this? Yeah. Yeah, just give me 1 second, right? So are we okay with this? So in fact, the next question, and we'll have some values when we go to it, but how do I calculate dead weight loss? Okay. With dead weight loss, we actually don't need the average total cost curve, right? With dead weight loss, what we're doing is comparing to that perfectly competitive outcome. So the perfectly competitive outcome was where supply was equal to demand. A perfectly competitive market, that's our ideal scenario. That's where total surplus is going to be maximized. What is total surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost of production. Of a market, right? So what is the marginal benefit of a market represented by? Demand. Here we've got our marginal cost, which we can also think about as supply. So initially, my total surplus would be this entire area. Now, if I have a monopolistic competitive firm, they set the quantity. I guess I could use red here, where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. They go up here to set the price. What surplus are we missing out on? All of these units, right? Every unit here, the difference between our supply and demand curve, all of that surplus is lost. That's going to be our dead weight loss. Now, before we go back to the visual and actually calculate it using some values, one thing to notice, and this can help you if you have like 2 questions like we actually do when we go back to the practice exam. What is the height of my dead weight loss triangle always going to be? The difference between price and my marginal cost, or the markup. Part of dead weight loss came from the fact that firms were charging a price above the marginal cost. Part of it comes from the fact that they are restricting quantity, right? So kind of that width of our dead weight loss triangle represents the effects of the fact of the restricting quantity. The height of that triangle reflects that they're now pricing it above what it costs them to produce it. Okay. Did that get at your question? So with this depiction, we can think about how do we apply it to this graph. Okay. If I can get this up here, there we go. So the perfectly competitive market would be where that marginal cost or supply hits demand. The monopolistic competitive, we said, was down here at 20. So all this area in between marginal cost, which represents supply, and our demand curve would represent dead weight loss. So we already said the height of that triangle is going to be our markup, or 80 minus 40. And the number of units that were restricted by the monopolistic competitive market or firm, that was 6. 6 times 40 gives me 240. That's going to be dead weight loss, right? What else do I need to do? It's a triangle, so multiply it by a half. Right? So there I know my dead weight loss is going to be 240 times a half, or 120. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay, so the next thing I could do, probably will do it in the exam, is give you a word problem like this, okay? So I'm giving you a firm's quantity they're producing, marginal revenue, marginal cost, average total, average variable, and the price they're charging. Okay? So when are profits positive? Whenever price is above my average total cost. Is that price of 85 above my average total cost at this quantity? No. So what do I know? Whoops, I'll write these in the same order. My profits are going to be negative because that price of 85 is less than my average total cost. So I now have 2 decisions to make. Do I shut down, or do I stay open if I have negative profits? Okay. So I'm actually asking you about the value of profits here. you might initially think, well, I'll go to my old profit equation, which was simply the quantity I'm producing times the difference between price and the average total cost. So if I do that here, oops, I would get what? 25 units times the difference between price and my average total cost. This is what, if I'm doing math in my head correct, negative 375. So I go with D. I get this wrong. So why? Because my shutdown rule, I only stay open if price is above my average variable costs. Is the price of 85 above my average variable cost? No. So if price is below average variable cost, we said we should shut down. If I shut down, what were my profits? So down here, if I stayed open, there was my profits, okay? So we'll get these to line up. If I shut down, we said my profits are what? What do I still have to pay? Fixed costs. My fixed costs, well, if my average fixed costs were my fixed costs over quantity, we said, and I went through this, I think, last class and back when we looked at perfectly competitive markets, that's going to be my average fixed cost times quantity. Well, how would I calculate my average fixed cost? I wasn't given them here. My average total would be my average variable plus my average fixed. So the difference between my average total and my average variable cost here, that represents my average fixed costs. So if I then multiply that by quantity, that's how I would determine my profits if I shut down. So here that would be what? 100 minus 90 times 25, or 250. But I got to be careful here. Once I get to this shutdown decision, why was I even there? Because profits were negative, right? So what I need to not forget is, oh, this is how I calculate fixed costs, but there's always a negative sign out front because I know I'm paying, right? If I only have costs, my profits, are negative, those fixed costs. So one nice thing here is if I worked through all of this for both scenarios, if I did stay open, my profits, I was losing $375. If I shut down, I'm losing 250. Which of those is better? Losing 250, which means I should shut down, which is exactly what my price relative to average variable cost is. So you don't have to go through both of these every single time. I'm just doing it here to kind of show you that this price average variable cost rule of whether or not I stay open or shut down will always lead me to the right answer. Okay. Questions on this idea? So this almost makes the next one a little bit easier. If I have the same kind of idea here, well, now I change the variable cost. If price is above average variable costs, I know I should stay open, right? But price is still below my average total. So I know profits are negative. Right? If my profits are negative, what's going to happen to the in the long run? Well, I think here I just asked you about quantity, but we can think about everything. So we actually kind of worked through this earlier, that if I have negative profits, so we were kind of starting out with a scenario where whatever that demand curve was, at that profit maximizing quantity, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, that was below my average total costs. So here I had profits, but they were negative. That's where we started out. If profits are negative, what are firms going to start to do? Over time, some firms are going to choose to shut down or exit the market. As they exit the market, what happens to the demand that the remaining firms face? Well, they're going to now have market demand hasn't changed, but each firm, if I'm now splitting market demand amongst 10 instead of 20 firms, each firm is going to face a higher demand curve. Do you have a question? Okay, sorry. So demand would then shift to the right. But if demand shifts, so does my marginal revenue curve. So as firms exit this market, demand increases, which increases my quantity. Increases my price. And now when price is equal to average total cost, profits are now zero, right? Or as firms exit the market, profits are increasing. They're going from negative to zero, they're increasing, okay? So the reverse would be true if I have positive profits. So if I gave you a similar work problem, but price is above average total, their profits are positive, you know firms are going to exit. So now firms get a smaller portion or smaller market share, smaller portion of overall demand. Demand shifting to the left, decreases price and quantity until profits are equal to zero. So firm entry and exit is what we rely on to push these monopolistic competitive markets to that profit of zero in the long run. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So I've got a few things that I want to say. So we work through kind of the monopolistic competitive questions on this first practice exam. Once again, based on your responses to the in-class quiz, I'll adjust my recording tomorrow accordingly to kind of what was the most frequent answer to what you want to see reviewed. Now, in terms of review, what do you still have available to you leading up into the final? So I'll post that video. We'll meet in class next Thursday. My office hours next week should be they are going to be the same on Monday and Wednesday. There might be, I'll post an announcement, a 30-minute window where I have to take a Zoom call, but I'll just push my office hours 30 minutes later if that ends up being the case. But for the most part, same office hours next Monday and Wednesday. I'll also have office hours that Monday of finals week on Monday, not Wednesday because we're taking the exam Wednesday. Those tutoring sessions are still available Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday nights this week and next week. CL sessions covering Module 13 tonight and Monday. There's going to be additional CL sessions next Thursday. I'm still waiting on some responses from my CL leaders about which of those time slots will be available. Right now, 6 of the 9 are available, so there will be quite a few. Other than that, those are kind of your resources. So before you get ready to pack up, I'm going to give you some information that I think will be helpful to you, right? I don't have to do this, but I try to be a good person, okay? So the way in which I would study, I mean, a lot of questions, said this for the other two exams. What's the first thing I would start with? Practice exams. It will be very representative of the questions you see. What I would do is not simply look at them. Did I get it right? Did I get write out a graph or use an equation to create a solution for every single one of those problems. If those solutions lead you to a wrong answer, make sure you can reproduce a correct solution that supports that correct answer. There's almost 60 questions of those practice. It's going to take you a while. If you want, I would then go back after that. If you just want more questions, do a similar thing, but for all the old quiz questions. Because I know a lot of you use generative AI tools to answer those quiz questions, just get a good grade. What do you think? Is that going to help you on the final? If it didn't help you, you don't know the concepts, which is what I saw play out in the other two exams. Right? The quiz scores are significantly higher than the exams. I wonder why. Right? So make sure you're going back and reviewing those quizzes because you want to actually understand how to solve and provide a solution as to why those questions aren't correct. Once you do that, if you want more, go back to the practice problems from each week. Do a similar thing. Okay? Now, after that, I know a lot of you, and I'm getting questions, people are throwing things in a notebook LM, throwing them into chat, trying to create more questions. I would be hesitant with that because if you're doing that and you upload like all the, say you go to chat and you go, here's some final exam, reproduce some similar questions for me. You are going to get questions that are well above the difficulty of this class. You are going to get questions that are not quite the same that I'm going to ask you. In fact, I've seen people do this. It gives them a lot of definition questions. You see a lot of definition questions and no, right? So you're just wasting your time on questions you're not going to see on the final, right? So if you just dump all the class materials, especially someone even showed me they put in not only the practice finals, but like the top hat readings and the notes. Well, some of the notes we covered, I said, I'm not going to expect you to know this. Right? This was kind of towards the end. Sometimes I throw in some additional things. I think I did like a labor market monopsony example, which I'm not going to ask you on. You don't see it pop up on any of those questions. So if you just dump all these materials into AI, it might be producing questions that aren't actually productive for you to spend time on. If you want to use these AI tools, I have these conversations with people that stop by my office. If I was Kelly,